Hey everybody, welcome to this video. I'm going to be talking about how to do research for your organizational assessment project. And I'm not only going to talk about the specific tools, but I'm going to talk about using models, organizational development models, to help you think through all the various elements of your project. So I'll also talk about some of the kind of bigger issues in research, the different approaches, qualitative versus quantitative, and also talk about your role as the leader, as researcher, and some of the implications and how you may need to mitigate against some of the impact that you're going to have when you do this type of research. All right, doesn't that sound like a lot of fun? Yeah, it does. You're all excited and charged up and ready to go. So without any further ado, give me one moment here, and I'm going to share some slides for you to follow along. All right. Whoa, look at that. It's so big. Look at me. I feel so small compared to this. All right, here we go. Organizational research methods, tools, tricks, and techniques. Following presentation is designed to give students assistance in doing an organizational assessment project. Students will need to know how to collect and analyze data from their chosen organizations and present it in a clear and comprehensible way and offer suggestions for improvement. So again, what you're doing here is you're thinking about some issues or concerns in the organization, and you're doing research. You're going to collect some data, reflect on the data, and then give some recommendation recommendations for improvement. And this is a real serious kind of endeavor. You can have a big impact on leadership management's thinking about the organization and ways to improve, not just anecdotally somebody's opinion, but you're actually going in there, taking the time to research. And this is the type of research that organizations will, pay consultants a lot of money to do. So this is a big value added project for you and your organizations. Now, I want to talk about some larger research issues, and some of you may be aware of some of these from other areas of study in your program. The difference between research method and methodology. Typically, a methodology is more of a big picture overall strategy. So quantitative versus qualitative, phenomenological, uh, those are kind of larger approaches to thinking about research, as opposed to methods, which are more of the specific tactics and tools that you're going to use. So a survey is a method. An interview is a method. Okay, so a survey is not a methodology. It's part of a methodology. It's part of a strategy. Does that make difference? Does that make sense? I hope it does. And then, of course, the perennial favorite, quantitative versus qualitative, and mixed methods, where you do a little bit of both here. So quantitative uses numbers to make comparisons and correlations. Sometimes you'll do inferential statistics. For this project, you're probably not going to be doing a whole lot of sophisticated stuff, but simply demonstrating, counting, basic kinds of counting of percentages and stuff. Uh, so surveys typically is the way that you'll do a lot of quantitative research versus qualitative, where you're using non-numerical data such as text, words, objects, images, etc. So typically interviews and observations, focus groups, looking at written documents, text documents, etc. That is qualitative research. And then mixed methods means when you do a little bit of both. So maybe you'll start off doing some interviews, and you might get 5 people that kind of give you the impression that this is an important issue. And then you can take that and turn it into a survey and ask 100 people whether they think that's an important issue, right? So you kind of move from a hunch in the quantitative to more of a fixed idea in the qualitative. I'm sorry, a hunch in the qualitative to more fixed idea in the quantitative, and you can get a broader swath of reality. So another way to think about this difference too is that typically with interviews and focus groups, the qualitative methods, keep getting those confused here. With the qualitative methods, you can go very broad, but you can go very deep, but you can't go very broad. So in an interview, you can find out a lot of information, but it's only from one person. As where quantitative methods, like your surveys, you can go very broad. You can ask a lot of people, but it's a very limited scope because you can only ask them so many questions, right? That's another way to think about that. And this chart here simply shows you some of the purposes and approaches to the different research methodologies here. And I'm in the way. Take a screenshot. All right, there we go. And I have these slides available also in the class too for you to glean from. Now, one thing you also want to consider too is what's called reactivity, and this can refer to a situation when individuals, i.e., the people that you're researching, alter their behavior to conform to the expectations of the observer. So, for example, there's something known as the Pygmalion effect. It occurs when students or those who are being observed alter their behavior to meet the researcher's expectations. So what does this mean? This means that perhaps if you're the leader or the manager as the student doing this project, and you talk to one of your subordinates or somebody, or even one of your leaders, your manager, they may change their answer to give you the type of answer they think that you want to hear, right? So oftentimes they'll give you a more positive impression of the organization. Um, if they're concerned about the reputation or your attitude towards the organization, they may kind of fudge things a little bit. So this is why it can be difficult for the leader as a researcher to actually get accurate information. And so you have to do your best to create a very open and honest type of dialogue and let people know that this, first of all, they're anonymous. um, their names won't be used, it's confidential, and that you want them to tell you, their real thoughts and ideas, both in interviews and surveys and those such. Now, all right, so let's move on here. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is using an OD model. And it's important to use a model to help you think about abstract organizational phenomena, right? Because the first thing you're probably thinking is, man, there's so many different things, so many different variables and questions, lines of questions, concerns. Um, you're studying a lot of organizational phenomena in this class. So you're probably thinking, well, how do I organize this? How do I kind of come up with an angle and make this manageable? That's why you think about this in terms of a model. So I'm going to present several models that'll help you conceptualize and organize the various issues and concerns you will typically encounter when doing this kind of project. Okay, so some of these will be familiar to you because we've studied these in the class. The first one I want to present is using Bowman and Deal's four frames. And if you recall, Bowman and Deal talk about the structural frame, right? This is sort of your typical conventional wisdom. This is what we think of in as organization. It has to do with lines of reporting, org charts, but it also has to do with things like centralization, decentralization, formality, informality, those sorts of things. So this is an important way to think about an organization and phenomena. Then the human resources frame has to do with people, motivation, training, evaluation, reward systems, and those sorts of things. Political frame has to do with power structures, embedded power structures, and such, and coalitions and vying for scarce resources and all that. And then the cultural frame has to do with things like values, history, rituals, myths, the way that we do things around here, right? So there's some of those soft, unspoken realities that really guide a lot of behavior. Okay, so I think this model here helps you cover like 90% of any organizational phenomena you're going to encounter. And so you can frame your study in terms of these different types of concerns. Now, the next one that's very useful to you, and this is really when you're thinking about your change strategy, right? So this might come in conjunction with another model. I don't think it would be adequate to just use Lewin here, but think about Lewin's force field analysis, where he talks about the current state of affairs and those forces driving change and those forces resisting change, and creating that disequilibrium during the change, and then locking it in and reestablishing of the new normal, right? So you may think about if there's a problem that you want to address, that you want to make recommendations, you have to think about disrupting the status quo so that people are open, and how do you go about doing that, and then how do you move it to where you want things to be and establish a new normal, right? Okay. um, Another good model here is Wiesborg. He has a 6-box model. And so this, some of this, again, you're going to see overlap between these models here. But if you think about these 6 areas here, purposes, what is the organization's purpose, mission, goals, those sorts of things. Structure, similar to the structural frame that we talked about, Bowman and Deal. Reward system, Bowman and Deal, this would come out of that HR area, right? Helpful mechanisms, any kind of structure, technology, relationships, formal relationships, informal relationships. We know that a lot of work happens in informal relationships, right? So when you're thinking about relationships in terms of an OD perspective, you're not just thinking about who reports to who on the org chart. You're thinking about real relationships that impact people's behavior. And then they put leadership in the middle here because leadership, it's not the center of the universe, but it does impact a lot of this other type of behavior. And the leader's job really is to manage and influence the kinds of behavior evolved around that. And also notice here too, they have the input here and the output. And what does that mean? That's like an open systems model. If you recall, open systems model suggests that an organization exists in an environment. Inputs come in like people, resources, money, all those sorts of things, ideas. There's transformation that happens, and then things go back out into the environment and they kind of circle back around. Okay. The next model here is McKinsey's 7S framework. They refer to the hard S's, so things like strategy, structure, and systems, again, similar to Bowman and Deal's structural frame. Style, staff, and skills. This might be more akin to Bowman and Deal's HR issues. And then shared values. Okay, Bowman and Deal's culture, right? Value has to do with culture. So this is a good way to think about an organization and phenomena that you may want to study. And I think what's interesting about this model here is notice how everything is connected and everything revolves around shared values. So if you go back to, for example, this model here, leadership is in the center. On this model, shared values are in the center. And why do you think that is? Because, well, leaders, let's face it, leaders embody and represent and articulate the values of the organization. They're sort of the standard bearers, either verbally or through implicit behavior about what's important to the organization. Okay, all right. So those big picture things, that has to do with, let me stop here. That has to do with some of the larger ways to conceptualize an OD project, lines of approaches in things you want to things you want to research in particular, right? Whether it's structure, strategy, culture, systems, all those kinds of things. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about here, what I would refer to as specific research methods or data collection strategies. So how do we learn about all those things? Well, you're going to investigate them. You're going to open up lines of inquiry into the organization by using some of these research methods. So let me share again, and we'll move through some of these specifics that I think will be very helpful for you. No, there it is again. Whoa. Wait, I have to go farther though. Hold on, let me get it here. Okay, so OD requires that research is conducted. Did I already mention this to you? Requires that your organization, that you have access, right? Okay, so this is important, that the leadership allows you to do this sort of project and that people are willing to take the time. If you don't have those things, you're not going to get very far in an OD project. And then the three main methods that I'm going to talk about here are surveys, interviews, and observations. Now, surveys can either be theory-based, so based on a particular known theory, or they can be an ad hoc collection of questions and interest. Okay, so for example, the BCWI engagement survey, the OCAI, which has to do with organizational culture, these are already designed. You can implement them. They're validated and give you really strong results. So these are good for, so surveys are good in general, okay? So you can use a theory-based instrument like this, or you can create your own type of instrument. So let's just say you're concerned about structural issues, centralization versus decentralization. You can create a line of questions that ask people about their perceptions about that. All right. Or if you're interested more in like training, say you're concerned about the training, the effectiveness of the training in the organization, you can create your own survey that asks people about their perceptions of the training. Do they go to training? Is the training effective? Does it change their behavior, et cetera, et cetera. So you can create your own line of questioning with surveys. Now, the strength is that they're good for collecting a lot of data and for giving results that reflect the overall consensus of the organizational members. So if you got a large organization, you can collect a lot of data. The weakness is that, well, first of all, the professional ones cost money. And second of all, they don't go in very deep into why people think and feel the way they do. So the rule of thumb here is that surveys go broad, but they don't go very deep. Now, you can develop your own survey based on questions of interest. That would be what I would call an ad hoc survey. Use major areas of interest to explore and gain data. So when you're looking at your model and you're thinking about areas of inquiry, that's where you can focus your survey in on. I like a 4-point Likert scale here. You're probably familiar with this. Strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree. Some people use a 5-point scale and they have a neutral in here. That's the I'm not sure option, right? I don't like the I'm not sure option because that doesn't tell you anything. So I think if you force people to take a side here, that's going to tell you more information than if they say, I'm not sure. And at the end of the day, if people think about it, they'll probably say, I probably agree with that more than I disagree. All right. So you kind of push them over the edge by not having that option in there for them. All right, so here's some examples here. If you have a hunch that there's poor morale, you might develop a question like, people are really excited about working here, right? Now, what's the answer going to be if there's poor morale? The answer is going to be strongly disagree, right? See, this is kind of like a reverse question there. If you want to find out how formal the organization, and what frame is that, by the way? That's right, that's the structural frame. You might ask a question like, there's a policy and procedure for everything around here. And if they say yes, strongly agree, you know, if 90% of your people strongly agree, guess what? You've got a highly formal organization. If you want to find out if the organization is more model 1 or model 2, and I'm not sure if we covered that particular one in this class, but you can ask something like, people are just going through the motions here. No one's actually committed to the mission. All right, so I'm not going to teach on model 1, model 2. You can do a little bit of research on your own if you're interested. Chris Argyris developed that particular model. All right, questions should have a basis in different aspects of one of the concepts related to OD, for example, conflict, morale, change readiness. Avoid interesting but tangential questions. Okay, so here's the problem I think that a lot of student researchers have is they're like, oh, I really want to find out if people, you know, say it's a church context, if they want to come to the early service or the late service. That's a good question, but it's not really an OD kind of question. OD, you're trying to get the people, personnel, i.e. employees, staff, volunteers, perceptions on things, not a congregation's member on service times, right? So avoid padding it here with things that you want to know about, but that are tangential to the concerns of organizational development. The questions should be as unambiguous as possible, i.e. very clear to the reader, only one idea per question. So avoid the tendency to ask them like 2 different things in one question because they'll be confused. The survey should be able to be completed in less than 15 minutes. I would probably even shoot for like 8 minutes or 5 minutes because again, people are busy, and if you give them, you know, 100 questions, they'll never fill it out, and you'll have incomplete surveys, which you can't use. And then also consider using a sample size calculator, because one of the questions that students always ask me is, well, how many responses do I have to get? Well, use a sample size calculator and it'll tell you. The rule of thumb here is that the smaller the organization, the larger percentage of surveys you have to get back to be accurate. So what you're shooting for is reliability, and there's 2 numbers you're looking for: the reliability and margin of error. Okay, so those are the 2 numbers. So when you use a sample size calculator, it'll tell you how reliable it is, and that's usually like 95%. And then margin of error is like your, you know, 3% or 5%. Okay, so the less number you have relative to the size of the organization will determine that right there. So what you should do in your report is, once you get your data, you can run the numbers in the sample size calculator and say, according when running for sample strength, I can attest that this is 90% reliable with a 5% margin of error. Okay, so that's how you can think about the amount of surveys you have to have. What do you do with the results of surveys? Well, I would recommend using something like Excel. It's a great program for tracking survey data. You can do what are called cross tabulations, where you say things like 70% strongly agree, 20% agree, 10% disagreed. You can make comparisons, but not correlations. Okay, so correlations is a technical term, and you're not really doing correlations for a project like this. So you could say things like 80% of men agreed, but only 10% of women agreed, right? Okay, so that's an interesting comparison. And then you can also use a program like SurveyMonkey, which does a lot of the math for you. So consider something like that. Google Forms. Both of these, Google Forms is free. SurveyMonkey has a free version. Take a look at it and see if the free version gives you the kind of data that that you need. All right, let's shift gears here. Interviews. This is more of a qualitative approach, right? They're a wonderful way to obtain rich and deep information about what's really going on in an organization. The strength is that you get this deep, rich information. It gives you a window into why people think and feel the way they do. And this is important, right? You're really trying to get at the root of things here. And so you want to understand why people think the way they do. The weakness is, though, of course, it's time consuming, and then there can be subjective interpretations. As a researcher, you might kind of read into what people are saying, and it may make it hard to come to any conclusions. So, conducting the interviews, select organizational members that you feel have good insight into your area of interest. So, there's no need for a random sample. Okay, so random sample is a quantitative term usually when you're doing survey research, right? You can pick people that you think will make good interviewers. That's fine. Select members from various areas in order to give you a variety of views. So let's just say you have three different departments in the organization. Don't just pick all your people from one department because that's going to give you a skewed view, right? It's only going to reflect the views of that particular area. Try to get a couple people from different areas. It'll give you a more well-rounded approach. And then develop a standard set of questions and use those in all interviews consistently, right? So come up with 3 or 4 questions and ask those. Now you can bunny trail a little bit, that's interesting, but make sure you at least at the minimum get to the answer to that set of questions for all the interviewers, because then what you're going to do is you're going to relate those to one another. Some do's and don'ts. Don't probe into areas that are uncomfortable for either you or them. And again, this has to be a low risk project. So you don't want to get anybody into trouble. You don't want to get them in a situation where they're saying things they don't want to talk about, right? Because again, people are protective and they don't want to share anything that's outside of the boundaries of what they're comfortable with in the interview. Resist the urge to help or give them the right answers. Okay, remember we talked about reactivity. So don't tell them, don't wink at them or kind of nudge them or give them leading words that might get them to say what you want them to say. And you're not there to counsel them. You're not there to help them. And again, we're all helping people. There's an urge to say, oh, I heard you say that. And let me share my thoughts and my feelings. And let me encourage you on this one, my brother. This is a research interview. Resist that impulse. Now, later on, if you hear some information, you can always come back and say, hey, when we did that project, you shared this, and I just wanted to follow up on that. That's fine. Do that afterwards, but don't counsel them during this particular process. It's not the same as counseling, so don't use that active listening techniques. Let them speak and you listen. Allow them to think, pause, search for answers, and allow them to tell you what you may not expect or even want to hear, right? So you have to leave space in there. And this can be uncomfortable interviews, but leave some space and some time for them to think and reflect. And then, of course, respect their time and privacy. So don't give them too much time to think, right? It should be within a reasonable time. And I'd probably say maybe a half an hour is probably reasonable time for most people to share, maybe 45 minutes. But remember, that's a lot of data you got to go through. So I always encourage people just kind of make it more concise. And then, of course, don't divulge any information, personal information or identifying information in the thing. Asking the right questions, make your questions open-ended, not yes or no. So don't say, do you think we should do this? Yes, no. Perhaps saying something like, how do you think we should do this or that? Okay. Or how do you feel about this, right? And make your questions clear as possible, et cetera, et cetera. Keeping track of the data, record the interviews, and then transcribe them. Consider using something like Temi, which is a great service. It's very reasonable. You submit the recording to them, and they'll give it back to you as a transcription. And what you do is you'll listen back, and you'll make sure it's accurate. You're going to have to make some corrections. They're not perfect, but it'll do like 90% of the transcriptions for you. And develop a standard interview form that you can use for each interview. I kind of mentioned this, right? And then when the interview's over, take a few minutes and write down some key impressions on how things went while they're fresh. Now, what do you do with the results? First of all, you want to develop what's called a code book, or maybe a list of code, a word or term given to each instance of a recurring response. And then you can cluster those codes into metacodes. So you might, when you're first going through it, you might come up with 30 different things that you heard, but then you start to realize, well, these 5 things are about this, and these 5 things are about that. So you begin to cluster this together. So at the end, you can say, there was 5 main topics that I heard when I did my interviews. Look for trends, patterns, themes that emerge, et cetera, et cetera. Summarize the information in your own words, right? Okay, so you want to kind of come up with a summary of what you heard, what the sense was from people. Uh, Maybe use some sample quotes, right? So maybe if somebody said something like, yeah, this perfectly represents this idea that I was hearing. And then think about how these trends and patterns either confirm or deny your initial suspicion about what was taking place. So you might go in with a hunch, for example, that uh, the organization is too informal, right? And you might hear lots of things like, yeah, we don't write anything down and we're changing our policies every day, right? Okay, so that was your hunch. It was informal. And then they supported your hunch through some of the things they said. And then the last one is observations. It's simply looking around and reporting what you see. No interpretation is initially made, simply reporting on observable data. The strength here is it allows you to see what's there and it's not based on someone's opinion or interpretation, right? And it's easy to do. No one else's time is needed except for yours. Weaknesses, it requires time and it requires you to interpret and give meaning to what you see, and it needs to be corroborated with other data. So what are some things you can observe? Well, you can observe meetings, right? This is a good one. This is a really interesting one. Next time you're in a meeting for this project, kind of put on your researcher hat and start to observe things like group dynamics, the climate, decision making, conflict resolution methods, all these interesting organizational phenomena. Just if you just look, you'll start to see things like, oh, wow, I see a power play here. I see decision making processes. I see people's attitudes, towards one another, towards the leadership, et cetera, et cetera. Conversations, look for power issues, empowerment, leadership style. Facilities, grounds, obviously, these will give you clues into the culture, the signs, and the symbols that are prevalent. And then, of course, documents. Read printed materials, brochures, websites, policies, all those sorts of things. What do you do with this data? You write up what you find. You have to give it some interpretation and meaning. Try to ask what's behind what you see. How does what you see agree with or run counter to other things you see, and learn about the organization? For example, does the printed mission statement say, creating innovative products to help the world, but no one you interviewed said anything about innovation or helping anything? This is a clue that there's model one type of behavior. Okay, so disconnect. Model one behavior is we say we're about this, but we're really about this. Okay, so there's not congruity between the stated mission and what we actually do. Okay, so in conclusion, the methods of organizational development begin with collecting real data, interpreting what's found, and using that as a basis for decisions and ideas for change and improvement. This OD change project will allow you to get a deep understanding of some of the dynamics taking place in your organization and make recommendations for making things better and the organization more effective. And that's what we want, right? We want better, more effective organizations. And you, as a researcher, can help them do that. So I hope this was helpful. Review this if you need to, review the slides, take your time, figure it out, and get out there and start collecting some amazing organizational data. It's going to help you in your project tremendously. So God bless you guys. Thanks for watching.